It's the moment that would change everything for Jamal Carter. Picture this. You're sitting in the courtroom, your heart pounding, the weight of the world on your shoulders. You watch as the judge, a man who holds the power of life and death over your brother, slams his gavel down like it's nothing. Your brother Darius, sentenced to life without parole for a crime he didn't commit. The jury snickers, their eyes cold and filled with judgment, their whispers dripping with scorn. And then it happens. Judge Holt leans back in his chair and lets out a loud, mocking laugh. He's laughing at Jamal, laughing at a 16-year-old kid in a thrift store suit, laughing at the notion that anyone like Jamal could challenge the system. But what they don't see, what no one knows, is that Jamal Carter isn't just any teenager. He's a genius. While others were out playing ball or chasing girls, Jamal was hunched over law books in the library, memorizing statutes, reading case files, and building a mind so sharp it could cut through the lies and corruption that had put his brother behind bars. The whole world might laugh at him, but that laugh, it wouldn't break him. It would make him burn with a fire stronger than anything they could throw at him. That laugh, that moment of mockery, would ignite the war he'd wage alone, a war that would take down a system built to crush him. The echo of Judge Holt's laugh haunted Jamal's thoughts that night. As he lay in the small bed he once shared with Darius, the sheets twisted around him, his fists clenched, and the weight of the world pressing down on his chest, he couldn't get that laugh out of his mind. He could hear it over and over again, like a cruel melody that played in the back of his mind. His brother was locked away, condemned by a system that didn't care. No one in that courtroom cared that Darius was innocent. All that mattered was the color of their skin, the prejudice in their eyes, and the decisions made before the trial even began. Jamal lay there in the dark, sweat beading on his forehead, his mind racing. He couldn't let this stand. He couldn't let this be the end. Not when he knew his brother was innocent, not when he had spent every day for years studying the law. The law wasn't just a collection of books to Jamal, it was a weapon he would wield with precision. It had to be the only way. He wouldn't let Holt's laugh be the final sound he heard when it came to Darius's case. At the crack of dawn, Jamal sat at the kitchen table, his fingers gripping a chipped mug of cold coffee, the steam long gone. The papers from Darius's case were scattered across the table, all of them jumbled, crumpled, and worn. He'd swiped them 2 weeks ago from the overworked public defender's office. It was risky, but Jamal knew the system wasn't going to help him. No one was. He couldn't trust anyone but himself. So, he snuck in when the lawyer stepped out for lunch and grabbed every piece of paper he could find. The case file was a mess, pages stained with coffee, corners bent, and notes scribbled everywhere. But Jamal didn't need neatness. His photographic memory was all he needed. He could scan each page, each line of text, and store it all in his mind. And that's exactly what he did. As he flipped through the arrest report, his mind absorbed every detail. Darius, 22 years old, accused of robbing a gas station on Peach Street. A weapon found on the scene that didn't belong to him. A shaky witness, a white cashier who claimed to have seen Darius pull the trigger. But Jamal knew something wasn't right. The timestamps didn't add up. The cashier's testimony was full of holes, contradictions, and discrepancies. Jamal's pulse quickened as he flipped through the sentencing transcript. The words burned into his brain as if they were written in fire. Life without parole, case closed, no appeal, no fight. Jamal's jaw tightened. There was no way he was going to let that stand. His brother deserved a chance, and Jamal was the only one who could give it to him. By noon, Jamal had drafted his appeal. Every word had to be perfect. Every statute, every clause, every legal term had to be airtight. He spent hours in the library, his fingers trembling as he typed on a borrowed laptop from his neighbor, Miss Tasha. Every section, every subsection had to be precise. Section 32 of the state code gave him 30 days to file an appeal, and Jamal was on day 2. The first part of his appeal was clear: ineffective counsel. The public defender had barely said a word in court. He had failed to challenge the false testimony, and he had done nothing to find new evidence. The second part, a grainy photo from Darius's phone showing him at a barbershop 3 miles away from the crime scene when the robbery took place. The timestamp on the photo, 9:32 p.m. The robbery happened at 9:28. Jamal slid the papers into a manila envelope, pulling on his wrinkled thrift store suit and heading to the courthouse. The building loomed ahead, gray and imposing. Inside it smelled like mildew, like the weight of decades of power and corruption hanging in the air. He approached the clerk's desk, his heart pounding, the sweat sticking to his back in the humid March air. The clerk was a middle-aged woman, Doris. Her eyes flicked over him like he was nothing. She glanced at the envelope, her lips twisting in disdain. "You can't just waltz in here with this mess," she sneered. "Are you a lawyer?" The word boy dripped from her tongue like venom, a slap across Jamal's face. He swallowed hard, holding her gaze, his voice steady. "I'm his brother. I have the right to file under state law, Section 32, subsection B." Doris snorted, pushing the envelope back toward him. "We don't take trash from kids. Get a real attorney or get out." But Jamal didn't back down. He had read the law and he knew his ground. "Mom," he said, his voice colder now, "you're required to accept this. Refusing would be a violation of my due process rights under Article 9 of the state constitution." Doris's face flushed, a dark shade of red, but before she could snap, another clerk wandered over, a balding man with a lazy eye. He took the papers, scanned them, and then tossed them into the trash with a smirk. Well, looks like we've got a kid playing lawyer," he laughed. Jamal's blood boiled, but he kept his voice cold, his face a mask of resolve. "You're breaking the law. I'll report you to the state bar." The clerk leaned in, his breath sour with coffee and old cigarettes. "Go ahead, boy. Nobody cares." The words hit Jamal like a slap, but he didn't flinch. The system might have been against him, but he wasn't about to let it break him. This was just the beginning. By the time Jamal left the courthouse, he had done what many believed was impossible. He had forced Judge Holt's hand, cracked the very foundation of the trial that had unjustly condemned his brother. The judge had been smug, confident that nothing could shake his empire, but Jamal had done it. He had found the mistake in the trial's transcript, a single overlooked detail, an 8-minute error in the prosecution's closing argument. That mistake alone invalidated the verdict. As Jamal stepped out of the courthouse, he could feel the weight of what he had just accomplished. It wasn't much, just a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And for Jamal, it was enough to ignite something bigger. He had cracked the wall, and now there was a chance, just a chance, that Darius might be freed. But as Jamal walked out onto the sidewalk, the reality of what he'd just set into motion began to sink in. This was only the beginning. The system he had fought against wasn't going to just roll over and let him win. They were going to come after him, and they were going to make him pay for daring to challenge them. But Jamal wasn't afraid. Not now. Not when his brother's life was on the line. The weeks that followed were a blur of court dates, legal battles, and relentless pressure. Jamal's appeal was just the start. The city, fueled by a spark of hope that Jamal had ignited, was watching. But so was Judge Holt. He wasn't about to let some 16-year-old kid, no matter how brilliant, make a mockery of him. Holt was no stranger to power, and he wasn't going to let some upstart tear down the walls of the empire he had built. He had connections, people in high places who would make sure that Jamal didn't get too comfortable. As Jamal continued to fight for Darius, he could feel the heat closing in on him. The system was fighting back. It wasn't just the courts anymore. It was the police. It was the people who worked for Holt. Word spread fast that Jamal had forced the judge into a corner, and that kind of rebellion could not be tolerated. One afternoon, as Jamal was walking home after another grueling day at the courthouse, the storm hit. He had just rounded the corner near his neighborhood when a police cruiser screeched to a halt in front of him. The car's tires slid on the wet pavement, and 2 officers spilled out, their eyes cold with menace. The taller one, a wiry man with a scar across his eyebrow, grinned at Jamal, his hands resting casually on his baton. "Well, well," the officer sneered, stepping toward him. "If it ain't Holt's little lawyer." Jamal froze, his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't back down. He knew the drill. They weren't interested in justice. They were interested in making him disappear. The shorter cop, stocky with a sunburned neck, circled behind Jamal, his boots crunching on the broken glass, littering the sidewalk. "You fit a description, boy," the officer sneered. "Armed and dangerous. Hands up." Jamal's stomach dropped. This was it. Holt had sent his thugs to take him down. He raised his hand slowly, making sure they saw the notebook in his right hand. "I just came from court," he said, keeping his voice steady despite the fear rising in his chest. The tall cop smirked, stepping closer until his sour breath hit Jamal's face. "Oh, we'll check all right," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Before Jamal could respond, the officer slammed him against the hood of the car. The pain shot through him, but he didn't flinch. They were trying to break him, but Jamal wasn't going to let them. He wasn't going to let anyone break him. The officers were relentless, throwing him to the ground and twisting his arms behind his back. They snapped handcuffs around his wrists, the metal biting into his skin. "What's this?" the shorter cop muttered as he searched through Jamal's pockets. His hand emerged with a small bag of weed Jamal had never seen before. The cop's eyes narrowed and a smile spread across his face. "Looks like drugs to me," he said. Jamal's mind raced. This wasn't right. He hadn't been carrying anything illegal. This was a setup. But how could he prove it? They were going to plant evidence on him, and they were going to make sure it stuck. "That's not mine," Jamal said, his voice shaking with anger. "You planted that. You can't do this." But the cops weren't listening. They just laughed. "Kid thinks he's smart," the tall officer said, his laughter echoing the mockery of Judge Holt. They shoved Jamal into the back of their squad car, the door slamming shut behind him. As the car sped through the streets, Jamal's mind raced. He knew he couldn't trust the system to save him. He had to save himself. They weren't just trying to silence him, they were trying to bury him, and he wasn't going down without a fight. Inside the police station, the officers threw Jamal into an interrogation room, the walls stained with years of neglect. He was bruised and battered, his head spinning from the assault, but his mind was still sharp. He couldn't give up now. He had to think. He had to find a way out. The officers weren't even pretending to follow the rules anymore. They tossed a bag of weed on the table in front of him, their eyes glinting with malice. "You're looking at possession, maybe intent to sell," one of the officers said, his voice low and threatening. Jamal could feel his blood boiling. This was their game. They were going to charge him with a crime he didn't commit, and there was nothing he could do about it. But then, a lifeline, his phone call. He knew who to call. He dialed the number for Ms. Lena, the one person who had always had his back. Her voice came through the phone, sharp and worried. "Jamal, what's wrong?" she asked, sensing the urgency in his voice. He quickly told her what had happened. The cops had framed him, planted drugs on him, and now they were going to make sure he stayed locked up. "I'm at the precinct," he said, barely able to get the words out. "I need help." Lena didn't hesitate. "Hold tight," she said. "I'm coming." The line clicked dead, and the officer snatched the phone from Jamal's hand. He laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Good luck, kid," he sneered. "Nobody's saving you from Holt." Jamal knew that Lena would come through for him. She always did, but he couldn't help the pit that formed in his stomach. What was Holt going to do next? How far would the judge go to make sure Jamal didn't win? As the minutes dragged on in that cold, sterile interrogation room, Jamal's mind churned. He couldn't trust anyone. He had to find a way to fight back, to expose the corruption that had taken everything from him. And somehow, he knew that the fight was only just beginning. The storm was rising, and Jamal could feel it in every corner of his life. After the botched arrest, after the endless battles in the courtroom, things were getting more dangerous. The city was on edge, tension humming in the air like the crackle before a thunderstorm. The police had their eyes on him, and Judge Holt's network was vast, its roots dug deep into the very fabric of the system. Holt wasn't just a judge. He was a king in this town, and no one dared challenge his authority, no one but Jamal. But with each move Jamal made, Holt pushed back harder, and the stakes were rising higher. The streets outside were alive with protests, fueled by the injustices that Jamal had exposed. People were waking up, seeing the cracks in the system, and they were angry. But Jamal knew, deep down, that Holt wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. He wasn't going to let his empire crumble. And so, as the city's protests grew louder, Jamal found himself caught in a game of survival, unsure of who could be trusted and what the next move would be. One evening, the tension reached a breaking point. Jamal had been walking home from the library, his mind consumed with thoughts of the next legal challenge, when a car pulled up beside him. It was an unmarked vehicle, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. He had a split second to react, but before he could move, the door swung open and two men stepped out. They didn't look like ordinary men. Their suits were pressed, their faces hard, like they were ready for war. Jamal's instincts kicked in, but it was too late. One of the men grabbed him by the arm, twisting it behind his back with a force that made Jamal wince. The other produced a phone, the screen glowing in the dim light. "You've been a problem for Holt, kid," the first man said, his voice like gravel. "Time for you to learn your place." Panic surged through Jamal, but he refused to show it. He wasn't just some scared kid anymore. He had fought to get this far, and he wasn't going to let these men take him down without a fight. They pushed him into the car, slamming the door shut behind him. The man with the phone held it out in front of him, showing Jamal a video, one he had never seen before. The video was grainy, the lighting terrible, but there was no mistaking the voice. It was Darius, laughing at the barbershop, completely oblivious to the crime that was happening miles away. The timestamp was there, 9:32 p.m. The robbery had happened at 9:28. It was the perfect piece of evidence, but the men didn't see it that way. "You think you're clever?" one of them spat, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Jamal. "This isn't over. You think you've won? Holt has friends in high places, and now so do we." The car lurched forward, the engine growling as they sped off into the night. Jamal's heart raced. He didn't know what Holt had planned, but he knew it was bad. He had made enemies, real enemies, and now those enemies were closing in. The next few days were a blur of meetings with his lawyer, trying to figure out his next move, while the danger around him continued to grow. He couldn't trust the police. He couldn't trust the courts. Even his own lawyer was looking over his shoulder, wary of the power Holt wielded. Jamal had known it would be hard, but he never expected it to be like this. And then it happened, the moment that would change everything. A letter arrived at Jamal's apartment. It was postmarked from an anonymous source, but Jamal knew exactly what it was. It was the evidence he had been waiting for, proof that Judge Holt wasn't just a corrupt judge. He was part of a much bigger, more dangerous network. The letter contained emails, reports, and financial documents. Everything Jamal needed to expose the full extent of Holt's empire. It was a bombshell, and Jamal knew it. This was his shot. He couldn't afford to wait. He had to act fast. The truth was out there now, but getting it into the right hands was a different matter. Holt wasn't going to let this go easily. He would do anything to protect his empire, and if that meant silencing Jamal permanently, then so be it. But Jamal wasn't afraid. This was his fight, and he wasn't about to stop. Jamal knew that if he was going to bring down Holt, he needed more than just the evidence. He needed allies, real allies, people who weren't afraid to stand up against the corruption that had swallowed the city. He reached out to Aisha, the reporter who had been following his story from the beginning. She had helped him before, but this was different. This was bigger. Holt was dangerous, and Jamal couldn't take him down alone. Aisha didn't hesitate. She was with him every step of the way. Together, they started planning their next move. They had the evidence, but they needed to leak it to the right people. The world had to know what Holt had been doing. The system had to be exposed for what it was, rotten to the core. Jamal couldn't afford to wait any longer. He knew that if he didn't act now, it could be too late. The tension in the city was building, but Jamal felt like he had a plan. They had the evidence they needed. Aisha was working to get it into the hands of journalists, and Jamal was preparing to file for Darius's retrial, armed with new proof that could set his brother free. He wasn't just fighting for Darius anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been oppressed by the system, for every person who had been wronged and silenced. But even as the plans fell into place, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Holt wasn't just going to let this slide. He would fight back, and when he did, it would be worse than anything Jamal could imagine. And then, as if on cue, the storm broke. The courthouse, the very heart of the city's corrupt system, was rocked by an explosion. Jamal watched from a distance, his breath catching in his throat as smoke poured from the building. The sound of the blast echoed in his chest, a reminder that the fight for justice came with a cost. Holt was still out there, still pulling the strings from the shadows. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but Jamal wasn't going to back down. The fight was far from finished, and now he had a new fire burning inside him. Holt had made it personal, and now it was time to take him down. Jamal didn't wait for the dust to settle. He couldn't. He knew that the longer he waited, the more time Holt would have to cover his tracks, to erase the evidence. The moment of truth was here. He couldn't afford to hesitate. The time to act was now. With Aisha by his side, he worked through the night, preparing to leak the evidence that would expose Holt's corruption to the world. They didn't care about the risk anymore. This was bigger than them, bigger than their own safety. It was about justice, about righting the wrongs that had been allowed to fester for too long. And in the end, they would bring Holt down. They had to. There was no other option. As Jamal sat at the computer, his fingers flying over the keys, he couldn't help but think of Darius. His brother's face flashed before his eyes, a reminder of everything they were fighting for. Jamal wouldn't let Holt win. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. This was just one more step in the fight for freedom, for justice, for everything that was right. And Jamal was going to take that step, no matter what it cost him. The air inside the courthouse was thick with tension, the kind of weight that settled deep in your bones. Jamal could feel it pressing down on him as he walked through the crowded hallways, his heart pounding with every step. It wasn't just another day in court, it was the day. The day he would either succeed in his battle against the system or see it swallow him whole. He couldn't afford to lose. Not now, not when everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, was on the line. Holt's empire had cracked, but it wasn't enough. Jamal had exposed part of the system's rot, but the final blow was still missing. He could feel it in his gut. The truth had to come out in full. Holt needed to be stripped bare, his corruption laid out for the world to see. Jamal's fight wasn't just for his brother anymore. It was for every person whose life had been ruined by the system, every face he had seen on the streets, struggling, oppressed, and silenced. But with each step toward the courtroom, Jamal knew there was something else hanging over him, something darker, something more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Holt wasn't just a judge. He wasn't just some crooked man on a bench. Holt was part of something bigger, a machine, a system that ran deep, its gears turning in the shadows, and now Jamal had poked a hole in it. The machine was angry. It was about to fight back. As he entered the courtroom, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. The crowd was restless, murmurs filling the space as reporters scrambled to get the best angles, their cameras clicking and flashing like the beat of a war drum. Jamal was used to the noise by now, the buzz of the crowd and the endless eyes on him. But today felt different. Today, the stakes were higher than ever before. Judge Holt, the man who had ruined lives without a second thought, stood at the front of the room, his back straight, his gavel clenched in his hand like a weapon. His cold eyes met Jamal's, a silent challenge passing between them. It was clear that Holt was no longer just a judge. He was a man desperate to protect his empire, a man who had already done so much to destroy others that nothing, no amount of truth, would stop him from doing whatever it took to keep his power. And Jamal knew it. He could feel the weight of Holt's anger bearing down on him. But Jamal wasn't backing down. He had come too far. Jamal stepped forward, his voice steady but his heart racing. He had everything he needed: proof, documents, testimonies, all the pieces of the puzzle that would finally bring Holt to his knees. As Jamal presented the evidence in front of the court, his hands shaking slightly, he couldn't help but feel the fire of his brother's memory driving him forward. The words he spoke weren't just for Darius. They weren't just for the innocent people who had been crushed under the system. They were for everyone who had ever been silenced, for every person who had been forced to live in the shadow of injustice. But the room was silent, and Jamal's voice echoed in the thick air. The room was still, the tension almost palpable, as he slid the final piece of evidence across the desk. Emails that linked Holt directly to the corruption, evidence of payoffs, illegal deals, and connections to private prisons, all in a neat pile of damning information. This was it. This was the moment where everything would either change or crumble. Holt's face twisted as he looked at the evidence, his eyes narrowing in fury. He didn't even try to hide his anger. His jaw clenched, his thick neck flushed with rage as he slammed his hand down on the bench. "This is slander," he growled. "This is all a setup. You've fabricated these documents, Carter. You've twisted the truth." The venom in his voice filled the room, but Jamal wasn't shaken. He stood firm, his eyes locked on Holt's. "It's not a setup, Your Honor," Jamal replied, his voice cutting through the tension. "It's the truth. You can't run from it anymore. You've been exposed. You can't hide behind your power, your money, or your connections. You can't bury this. Not this time." The room erupted, the crowd gasping in shock as the truth hung in the air like a thunderclap. Holt's mask was slipping. He could feel it. He could feel the walls closing in on him. And that's when Jamal delivered the final blow, the hospital records, the ones that proved that Darius wasn't just another casualty of the system. He was a victim of Holt's orders. A guard had been paid to silence him, to keep him quiet. Darius had been stabbed in prison, all because Jamal was a threat to Holt's empire. The room went silent again, the weight of the truth settling in like a heavy fog. Holt's face twisted in disbelief, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a desperation that was impossible to ignore. He had underestimated Jamal. He had underestimated the power of truth, and now it was too late to stop the inevitable. But even as Jamal stood in front of the court, holding his ground, he could feel the storm brewing. Holt wasn't finished. He never would be. Jamal had struck a blow, yes, but Holt had always been one step ahead. The moment the judge's anger boiled over, Jamal saw it. Holt lunged, his gavel crashing against the desk, his body shaking with rage. "You think you've won?" Holt spat, his voice a primal roar. "You're nothing. You'll never win here." The security guards rushed in, grabbing Jamal, pulling him back as the courtroom descended into chaos. But Jamal wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He had exposed Holt for the world to see, and there was no going back. It wasn't just a fight for his brother anymore. It was a fight for the truth, for justice. As he was dragged out of the courtroom, he felt a rush of triumph. Holt's empire had cracked. The truth had come out, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crumbling down. But Jamal wasn't done yet. He knew this was just the beginning. The next day, as he stood in front of the courthouse, watching the protests swell outside, he realized just how big this had become. The world was watching now. The truth had been unleashed, and the fight for justice had taken on a life of its own. Jamal couldn't stop now. Holt had exposed his true nature, and the world was finally seeing it. But even in the middle of his victory, Jamal knew that Holt wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. He had already caused enough damage. Holt wasn't going to let Jamal walk away unscathed. The battle wasn't over. The war was just beginning. and Jamal was ready for it. As Jamal left the courthouse, the streets outside were alive with energy, with people marching and chanting, their voices rising in unison. Jamal's heart swelled with pride. This was his victory, but it was more than that. It was the city's victory. It was the victory of every person who had been wronged, every person who had been silenced by the system. The truth had come out, and there was no taking it back. But even as the cheers filled the air, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Holt was still out there, still pulling the strings, and no matter how many victories he won, the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. But for now, Jamal stood in the middle of the street, looking at the faces of the people around him. He had done it. He had exposed the truth. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of that accomplishment. Holt might have been knocked down, but the fight was far from over. Jamal had made sure of that. Now he would fight until every last shred of injustice was gone. And, as the people around him chanted, Jamal knew this. He would never back down. No matter what came next, he would keep swinging, because in the end, the truth would always win.